Hello, dear creative leaders, future thinkers, and change makers around the world. I'm Ekaterina, co-founder of Future London Academy. And today we have an incredible guest. We've been waiting him for a while to have him on this podcast. I'm so glad today we finally have the incredible Stefan Sagmeister, my personal hero. I've been admiring his work, too many books of his and followed too much work to inspire my own design process. So I'm very glad today we'll talk to the legend about his work of design, running a company, being a creative in general in this complicated world. And also, what does it mean in terms of productivity, slow productivity, creativity? How much work should we do and shouldn't do to be our best creative selves? So please welcome the designer, the typographer, the writer, the incredible Stefan Sagmeister.
Thank you. That was quite an introduction. I'm sure I won't live up to it, but let's get into it.
Before we start, how are you feeling today? How are you doing right now?
Well, I'm sicklish, I have to say. I have the flu. I was in bed here in sunny Barcelona all day yesterday, but today, there's just too many appointments. So I'll get through it. I'll do my talk later on the stage, and I'll retire to bed shortly thereafter, for sure.
Is there often that you have to push yourself through sickness, tiredness to actually do the work that you need to do?
Luckily, I don't get sick all that often. I had 2 very mild cases of COVID, and so it's not a problem that happens to be on a repeated kind of basis. But right now, I'm very, very glad when this day comes to an end, for sure. Yeah.
Well, something to look forward to. Talking about productivity and doing more than we all can handle. I've always been inspired personally by your approach. I think since your TED Talk, when you talked about taking a sabbatical every 4 years, every 7 years, and I remember it was such a groundbreaking concept back then to take the whole year to explore. And you talked about how that would inform your future work and how important it is. And now I feel like you almost taken even a new step into this direction with how you approach work. I don't want to say work-life balance because that's the wrong thing to think about creativity, but in general, the balance between all the things that you do in life. How would you describe your current philosophy about creativity, about life, enjoying and getting the most out of it?
Well, I mean, I was lucky enough to work for a studio that became prominent enough that we really could implement the luxury 5 years ago to ultimately not do any commercial work anymore. And that wasn't driven from the fact that I suddenly started to hate commercial work. Not at all. Not at all. Like, I'm totally fine with selling. But it just seemed that I had done my share of it, that I had done enough of it. In the same way that after doing album covers for 10 years, I felt that the 50th album cover wasn't as much fun and wasn't as joyful or as exciting as the first one. And so, yes, about 5 years ago, we said no more commercial work. And what really then very quickly struck my fancy was this insight that when you look at the world from a long-term perspective, you get an entirely 180-degree different point of view about human development than you get from the short-term perspective. And of course, most media, both traditional and social, looks at the world from the short-term perspective, what happened today. And by definition and design, because negative things happen very quickly, they concentrate on negative things, which is okay, and I think it's necessary to kick us into action. But at the same time, when you get the different point of view from the long term, where almost everything developed very, very well and positively, I feel that this view is necessary to keep us from doom and gloom, because doom and gloom is not empowering. Most people who are depressed do absolutely nothing. And so I think this balance is necessary. We do need, if we want to achieve social change and change the many things that need to be changing, we need the whip and we need the carrot. And so we are basically, for the past 5 years, looking at the world from the long-term perspective, discover and communicate the many, 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 many things that developed surprisingly positively that many of us has forgotten in the meantime as a counterbalance. And that's been a very rewarding process, fun to do, joyful in its execution, and sometimes also be actually creating pieces like this for a client, but only if they are interested in this long-term perspective, it makes sense for them, and if they're willing to publish it without any logos or headlines or any of that sort, because not because I hate logos, I love logos, but because I discovered that we as an audience have seen so much shit in the commercial world that so many of us have become cynical, and as soon as they see a logo, they dismiss the message. So in order to keep the message from being dismissed, we insist on it being work that way. That doesn't work for every client, which is totally fine, but it works for some. And so I would say about 20 to 30% of our work is still client-based, and the rest of it is fully self-generated.
So when you say we stopped doing commercial work, does it mean you're not paid for your work, or you don't proactively get clients, or your clients are non-commercial organizations? What does it mean non-commercial
We
work?
still get paid for our work because that makes it sustainable, and otherwise we would have to stop doing it after a while, because ultimately it's an operation that needs income. We get paid for selling things in galleries and museums. We get paid for presenting things. And so there's income coming in, and it works from a financial point of view, but we don't doing anything, and that's the direct answer to your question, that is in any way promotional or advertising. We've done some work for the 5 major hospitals in Toronto. If those hospitals would have asked us to design their website or their brochure or an advertising for their services, I would have said no. But since those hospitals said, we have 5 tunnels that connect the hospitals, could you redesign these tunnels for us so patients are not scared when they are wheeled on gurneys to their next operation? We happily said yes.
That's brilliant. And I feel like this is so important for creatives at all points, actually, to think what kind of work do we want to do, what aligns with what feels right for us, what do we put out in this world, in the, as you said, in the longer term, what does it leave behind? And I wish more companies would think that way. But I wonder, where is this border, or what's your decision process around it? Because I think the example you gave is a brilliant example of a commercial organization that you can do work and get paid, but still do something that is meaningful and will create value to the people who are experiencing it. So how are there any, I don't know, criterias or like questions that you ask when the project comes in? Is this type of project that we want to take on?
Well, at the time when we still did commercial work, our main criteria and the real big question we asked us, would we ourselves use this product or service happily? If that was a yes, we took it on. If that was a no, we said no. And we said no to many projects. We also declined the biggest project that ever came to us because we wouldn't use that. And I think that eliminated many, many, many problems that we would have had otherwise. Most importantly, we didn't have to lie. And I think this is fundamental. And I know that I read an interview with Charles Saatchi where he kind of belittles the interviewer who is accosting him for doing advertising for the Tories, even though he himself is a liberal. And he thought, what do you think? Like, I have to drink milk to sell milk? And I say, yes, exactly. Exactly. You have to drink milk to sell milk, because otherwise you're a liar. And this is the reason why we all hate advertising so much, specifically the people who are outside of advertising. This is the reason why TV is now out, because people don't want to see your shit, because they don't believe what you're telling them, because they all think you're liars. I actually, having known people in advertising quite well, think that they are lying much less than the public thinks they are. But ultimately, I do believe that if you want to do a dog food commercial that's really good, you have to love dogs. But within agencies, that is not the criteria. Cat people are not asked if they want to do dog food commercials. And I think that's a huge mistake, both from a lying perspective, so there's an ethical element in it, but I think there's also, you're just going to make a much stronger commercial. You're just going to be much more interested. If you love cats and you get to do, you're going to be around cats, you're going to understand cats, you're going to be much happier talking about that commercial to your friends who also like cats, and so forth and so on. So, but probably most importantly, the consumer will feel that somebody who understands their cat is actually talking to them. That was during the time when we still did commercial work. Now that's kind of off. So in the last 5 years, that question didn't have to be asked. Now it's literally just, is it interesting? Do we like the people? Is there a proper timeline and budget?
And this is, by the way, brilliant. And I love what you shared about the kind of feeling, the work feeling right for the team, and actually using the products and believing in the products. I feel like this is so important. And I could not agree more that you will be more proud of the work that you do, and you'll get a better insight if you actually do believe in it. And it doesn't mean everyone in the world needs to believe it, but you personally, as a company or as an agency or as a person who works on the project, you need to like it, and you do need to believe that that's the right thing, even if there are others who would say otherwise. I think this is important for, I suppose, mental health as well. Talking about the agency that you have now, now that you focus on the self-initiated projects and projects that you believe in from a different perspective, how did it change the agency from the inside, whether it is the size, the structure, the types of people, or did it literally stay exactly the same and kind of nothing changed apart from the work that you take?
Oh, it changed radically. Yeah, meaning, in our history was that I started Sagmeister Inc. in 1993, ran it like that for, I don't know, 15 years. Then for 8 years, I partnered with Jessica Walsh as Sagmeister and Walsh, and we grew to quite a sizable size, which I have to admit I never really wanted. I was never interested in a larger company. And ultimately, Jessica and I said we are probably better off with our own places, because Jessica wanted to be more commercial. I wanted to be zero, the opposite. So it just made more sense to separate it. So I was back into Sagmeister Inc. Jessica was at Walsh, and they're doing very well and doing commercial projects, and they're completely fine. And my place changed radically. So from a situation point of view, I basically just need a couple of freelancers to help me here and there create pieces. We have a studio in the Brooklyn Navy Yard, but that studio is that's more like a woodworking studio than a design studio. So there is machinery there is painted, there is dirt being made because we make the artwork there. It's radically different. Yeah.
This is so fascinating what you're describing. And I do feel like the tactile things that as designers we love doing are so forgotten in the modern digital age, that hearing about your amazing studio where you could do all sorts of things by hand just makes me so excited, thinking how enjoyable probably that is to be in that environment and coming up with ideas in that place. Obviously, that journey that you had from having your own studio, having the studio with Jessica Walsh, and now your own, would it be possible to be in the place you are right now without those steps? Like, now, if you could go back in time, would you just start with what you have now, or you felt like those steps were necessary to arrive to where you are right now?
I would have to think about that some more. I think that in my case, what I knew at the time, these steps were necessary because I always wanted to be a designer. Even in art school, and I went to the University for Applied Arts, and we had painting classes, sculpture class, meaning they were like different sections, and we all, like, nobody sort of like felt above the other. And I really wanted to be a designer. So I don't think I could have arrived where I am now without all of those steps. I needed to try all these things out, including, I mean, I have to admit that, of course, it's much easier to make money with commercial work than it is with self-generated work. And so the luxury of the last 5 years and the future of the studio was also built on some very lucrative years where we had created commercial work. So I think it also, from a pure practical point of view, it wouldn't quite be possible in the same way. I also think, to come back to your mentioning of the joy of the physical, it was actually always said often, I've spoken here many times and sat out in the wonderful cafe there. And almost every time I was here, at one point at the conference, I was surrounded by 20-year-olds who asked me for tips on how they could go back into something printed or something physical, which always surprised me. In the beginning, it surprised me, considering I thought that the love of the haptic has something to do with my generation. But it turns out that I think it's a human thing, that ultimately I have a partner who is a UX designer, and she longs to get back into something more physical, into something that doesn't change and keep changing and changing indefinitely, in something that ultimately is done at one point. And I have to say, like, we make these physical objects, out of historic paintings that we put contemporary inserts inside, and seeing them completed and hanging. And I just come from an exhibition we had in Austria on top of a mountain at 3,000 meters, and seeing them unchanged in their physicality is just a pleasing thing. And I think that that's pleasing not just to me, but to many humans. As evidence, at one time I researched the nature of happiness for quite a serious time. And I remember, if you looked at it divided by professions, woodworkers, specifically people who made furniture, were very much on top of that pyramid, very simply because they actually saw at the end of the day what they made, and they could see their agency fulfilled in that sort of work, which is very different from if you work for a giant insurance company where you feel you're a tiny cog in that machine and you don't really see the outcome of your work. And there is plenty of research out there that basically shows, without any doubt, that all of us think of meaning ultimately as being much more important in our work than compensation.
Brilliant. Oh, thank you so much for mentioning this. And we were just talking actually about the younger generation of designers, and again, things that they might not be aware of from the history of design or the design industry. And one of them being the experience with tactile materials and physicality of things. Are there any other things do you feel like the new generation of designers do not know about or not aware of, that they should practice or should go back to actually be better designers with the tools that are existing now, with the advantages that they have now? But is there anything they can and should learn from the past of the industry that you've experienced?
I'm not sure. I just did a portfolio review an hour ago out there, and it was a young designer, clearly in her beginning 20s, a student still at a university that I know, that I've visited. Her work was brilliant, very technically much more advanced than I would say my own work would have been at that age. And I would say that the generation that is working right now is much more aware of what they want and in what direction they want to go than my generation was. I mean, when I was at art school in Vienna, half of the students never showed up, came maybe once a year at the end of the semester to try to get their paper signed. my feeling was that quite swimming into what direction they ultimately wanted to go. And I feel that the new generation knows much more about it. And I myself feel that that is quite a handy thing, that if you know early on in life what you want to do, you clearly have an advantage, because not just because you ultimately will have a couple of more years of experience, but I feel that, I think our brain stops growing at 29. And my theory, I'm not sure if that is scientifically correct, but my theory is that if you're already embedded in a direction when during the time when your brain is still growing, that's kind of introduction of that field to your growing brain cells is of much bigger importance. I actually had a long discussion about this with one of my clients, heroes and friends, Lou Reed, about this, who also wrote songs professionally for cheap record labels when at a very, very young age. Like his boss would come in and say, write me 10 songs about cars. And tomorrow it's 10 songs about surfing, and the day after it was about pool playing or so. And they would put out these cheap remainder bin albums. And Lou said that this was an unbelievable school for him to learn how to write the song, because he just tried out so much stuff. And of course, his then mentor, Andy Warhol, believed very much the same thing, that, ultimately that you're just going to do a lot. So in any case, if you can figure this out at an early age, you definitely have an advantage.
You obviously had different sizes of company, different structures of company, different types of partnerships. And I've heard in one interview you mentioned that the size of 35 was your favorite kind of size of running a. No, you never. I should never believe. Like,
Oh,
no,
the size of five.
five. Okay,
Yeah.
too big. Okay, so five. I would love to hear your reflection on, in general, anything to do with running a company, in terms of whether it's structure or how you lead as a founder, being in those different positions. What would you say you learned that if you had to do it all again, or maybe in the company that you're doing now, what are the lessons that you're taking forward?
Well, I really love to work in small teams. I had a mentor, Tibor Kalman, who basically said the only difficult thing in running a design company is to figure out how not to grow. Everything else is very easy. And I very much believed in that. We grew pretty much for the only reason because Jessica wanted to grow, with me being on the break, kicking and screaming. I believe that you can do the best work from a quality perspective in small teams. And it's not just the quality. I also find it's more joyful to work in small teams when everybody knows their contribution, where you actually let's say in a team of 3 or 5, everybody is very much aware what they actually contributed. If you work on the same job as 20, nobody really, maybe there's a single person who runs the thing, who really has ownership of it, but everybody else kind of like contributed a little, which also means that the chances that they don't give a shit is much higher. I was happily surprised by reading the biographies of people that have been doing very well, like Steve Jobs or even Elon, uh, who feel exactly the same way, meaning Steve Jobs extremely jealously kept his teams as absolutely tiny as possible and resisted every addition, because he was aware that even if you have a team of 5, to add one mediocre person and you are 6 will bring the entire quality of the team down incredibly. So I'm very much happiest at that. And I feel the only reason to grow would be financial, because of course, with a larger company, your profits can be larger too. I also know for sure, because I've kept the business diary for 30 years, that in years where we were very profitable, I was much less happy than in years where we did very good work. So I can really see that coloration within my business diary. So, and from that point of view, I'm very, I'm very happy to be back in a team of five. But also, if I look at the structure of larger design companies, let's say probably the only historic design company that is relevant right now would be Pentagram. And that has a lot to do with their internal structure because they're basically 30 partners with team of 3, 4, 5, maybe 8 people. So it's ultimately, it's 30 small design companies, and it's run like 30 small design companies that were smart enough to get together under one big name like Pentagram, which of course allows them to do gigantic branding projects because big clients feel more comfortable with larger companies. But ultimately, you know, if whatever, United Airlines is asking Michael Beirut to redesign their entire identity, it's designed by Michael Beirut's team of 5. So it's a great scheme and very much responsible for the fact that they are still relevant. And I think they just celebrated their 50th anniversary.
Do you think that might be the future of the creative industry in terms of the sizes? Because I felt like I'm hearing that from many people in the industry where they're resisting the growth and they're saying they do enjoy the small teams. And as you said, Pentagram is a great example of something they're successful in that structure. So maybe, yeah, these kind of combinations of teams of 5. Do you see that potentially being like the future of creative agencies?
I think that's one possible future. I mean, there are, of course, situations where you can't do it at 5. You know, I would say car design would be one aspect. If you're doing very large, if you want to do very large buildings within architecture, you can't really do it with 5. Or if you do it with 5, you have to partner with a local larger firm to do all the details, which of course has its own set of problems. Or if you do, you know, complicated animation films, you can't do a 90-minute animation if you're 5 people. I would say I just read Ed Catmull's book, one of the founders of Pixar, with a terrible title. I almost didn't read it, like Creativity Inc. I thought, I'm not going to read that shit. And it turned out to be fantastic because I think that he talks very eloquently about what strategies to use to make a necessary team of 500 that is necessary to create a 90-minute animation, how to keep that team from being a corporate idiocity and keeping it up on the very, very high end of coming up with newish ideas. And he has some very, very good tips there and some very surprising ones too. Still, I would say there's no other way if you want to do animation. If you want to do branding, you could rebrand any size company with 5 people. Now, if you want to replicate that by like Pentagram does and create 10 teams of 5 that work under one roof, that's also totally fine if that's your goal. But outside of that, I myself see no reason.
Love it. Oh my gosh, this gives me so many ideas in terms of where the future can go with the design industry. Thank you for sharing your perspective. I have one last question for you left, which is a bit more philosophical that we ask everyone who comes on our podcast.
Yeah.
If you could change one thing in the world, what would it be?
Huh. I would create a kind, well-meaning, and efficient government for the world. Because I think many of the problems right now that the world faces, be it global warming or the death of species, but even AI, are difficult to solve because you can't really solve it. Well, it's difficult to solve them unilaterally because if these guys create new rules, and these guys don't, then these guys will fall behind. I'm also very, very well aware that it's unbelievably difficult because a government of that size would create unbelievable bureaucracies. And we see that in many large organizations, be it large advertising agencies that are very difficult to deal with, or the EU, or even the US government. So I'm not quite sure how to do that, but I do believe that it would be very beneficial to all of us on the planet if there would be a efficient and kind government that ultimately is able to make decisions.
I love this answer, and I love the kindness as part of the necessary quality of the government, definitely missing from the current state. Thank you so much, Stefan, for all of your thoughts and thoughts about the future and the past, because I feel like it's so important to think about both if we want to move forward. And thanks for sharing this time. And thanks everyone for watching and listening to us. And until next time.